Welcome to Positive Read-Ins. Today's episode is based on an essay I wrote called Less Than Dad, The Strange Case of Frankenstein over Caleb Williams. You can read that essay on Substack. I've linked to it in the description. Please go and check it out. It will be ultimately, I think, more entertaining than this video, as all essays are. I think we watch too many videos these days. There's talk of a literary renaissance as if it's going to come from YouTube. I highly doubt that. And it's certainly not going to come from videos full of jump cuts and tier ranking and all that. You're not going to get that here. Okay, so I'm going to talk about this essay. This essay is based on some questions that I started asking after reading a recent rereading of Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. And I know some of you might be thinking, why are you reading the 1818 text? You should read the 1831 text. I've read them both, and this is the one I prefer. While I was reading this novel, obviously this novel is a popular novel. Everyone's heard of it, even if they haven't read it. But it's not actually a well put together novel. So we talk about this novel, it's famous, but it's not well structured. As a novel, it has a lot of problems. So why is it so popular? That's the question I asked, and that's what I try to explore in this essay. You can decide if I've come up with a satisfactory answer, and maybe you can write in the comments what you think the answer is. Maybe I'm way off. Anyways, check it out. So I'm going to start by talking about what we do know about this novel, what most people know. And I'm just going to quote from the essay. There's the part that everyone knows. A young man wishes to gain superior knowledge and reputation. So he combines the occult with modern science and endows a scavenged makeshift body of dead parts with life and brings a daemon into existence who ruins the young man's life. In this description, we have a remodeled Oedipus and Aristotle's lauded reversal, though perhaps lacking recognition and certainly the character requirements which we'll get to below. Seeking fame and accomplishment, and therefore the elation of status, Frankenstein instead brings onto himself recurrent woe and a no-mark life dedicated only to revenge. This is the mythical aspect of the story that has earned the novel meme-like virality and resonance in the Freudian sense. So that's the story most people know. As I said there, it's really a remodeled version of Oedipus, a character who pursues knowledge until he discovers it, and it brings about the opposite. It doesn't save him, but it actually destroys him. I said it lacks Aristotle's recognition because, as you'll see and as we'll talk about soon, Frankenstein never becomes aware of his problems. He doesn't learn anything, and I think that's why he's not a great character, not a great protagonist. Other than that, though, we'll get to the characters in a minute. The structure of the novel is also a problem. It's a messy plot. We have a first-person narrator, this guy named Walton, who's not important at all. He's telling the story, Frankenstein's story, which is in the first person. And then Frankenstein is also telling the being that he created, his daemon, as he calls him. He's telling his story. So we've got numerous narratives within a narrative, and all of this is supposed to be letters written by an unimportant character named Walton. So it's a mess. And because of this, many people mistake Frankenstein as the daemon. They think that that's the name of the daemon, but it's not. And I don't think they're to blame for that because of how messy this plot is. Worse, Frankenstein, our protagonist, is an unlikable character. As I said, throughout the novel, he continually makes the same mistakes. He doesn't really learn from these. But worse than that, he doesn't do much. And what he does is off-putting. I've counted 5 fevers that he has in the course of this novel, and I mean debilitating fevers that make him bedridden. These all follow the death of a family member. So it's understandable, but after over and over of fevers, not actually doing anything for these deaths, not preventing them in any way, not getting revenge on them, they become tiresome. They become a bit of an annoyance, right? We see this character who's incorrigibly helpless, and that doesn't make a good protagonist. So you might wonder, well, how about the Damon? Could he make a good protagonist? Most people think he's Frankenstein anyways. Well, I mean, some interesting things about him, right? In pop culture, we see him as this lumbering creature that, can't really move very fast. In the novel, he's very different. He's limber. He gets around quickly. He's well educated. Some things that you wouldn't know about him that are kind of interesting is he's a vegetarian, and also he's a French speaker, which I found kind of humorous, especially when you're imagining this lumbering creature, but he's also speaking French. All of this is revealed in a really important part of the novel. This is the most of volume 2. But the problem with this, again, has to do with the structure. In dystopian novels and sci-fi novels, the exposition is longer. You have to develop the rules of this world that you're going to be reading about. It's a different world, so you have to give all this up front to the readers, and sometimes you can sprinkle it in later as well. And that happens in the exposition. In the case of Frankenstein, that happens in the second volume, where we get all this really essential information about why the Damon is educated and also why he's is set on getting revenge. But we get this at a time when readers are expecting action, right? So the exposition has been delayed far too long, and it really zaps, I think, the power of the narrative. On this same point, thinking about the Damon as the protagonist, again, I'm going to quote from the essay. In another detail of unintentional comedy, we're to believe that this all-powerful Damon, who can span great distances with ease, conceal his person into private rooms, and kill at will, wants only one thing in life: a wife. Apparently, in his French education, he never came across the French proverb, marriage is a fortress besieged. Those outside want in, those inside want out. Jokes aside, while the Damon's desire for love and acceptance sometimes makes him more human than his creator, Frankenstein, it also makes his mission less believable. Considering the recent and unsurprising anthropological evidence for female modern humans' attraction to Neanderthal men, we can assume the Damon would do well on the courting scene. He may not be able to win over Elizabeth, Frankenstein's long-suffering and irritably patient cousin bride, but had he wandered through each chartered street near where the chartered Thames does flow, he'd likely find success. He may be hideous, he may not speak English, but he's a protector and a provider. This alternative storyline wouldn't be any less believable than the cat and mouse he plays with his creator to the ends of the earth, and would evoke equivalent ontological questions. So I make some jokes there, but I do think that this is a serious point, that if the Damon is really all he wants is love, he could have pursued it in better ways than just chasing his creator up into the North Pole. So it's not a well put together novel. The characters are not that likable. We don't have a strong protagonist, and yet the novel is still popular. Maybe it's the writing. Well, first I'll say that Frankenstein isn't the first novel that is culturally significant but not well put together. Moby Dick would be a good example of that. Moby Dick, however, I think it is rightly celebrated for its writing style. And Mary Shelley, while she's nothing like Herman Melville, I wouldn't compare her to Herman Melville. She's not a bad writer by any means, but I think a lot of her eloquence comes from just the time period that she was writing in. I think at that time, people wrote more eloquently. And so I would say that the legacy of Frankenstein doesn't rest on the quality of writing at the plot or sentence level, as I think it does, at least on the sentence level, it does for Moby Dick. So what is it that is making this novel popular still? And I think this led me anyway to an uncomfortable question, which I'm going to ask is the novel popular just because the writer is a woman? My answer is I don't think that's the case. I do think that the novel maybe is a sign still. Certainly in schools, I see there's an incentive or a push to try to assign more female writers. And certainly like this book, a new edition comes out and they have an introduction that I think exaggerates and maybe even distorts the feminist perspective of Mary Shelley, but you get that here. So that is a factor driving this, but I don't think that this is what is making the novel popular. However, this does bring me into the topic of sex and sex differences, and I think this does offer an answer to this question, just in a deeper way than just, is it popular because she's a woman? So this brings me to Harold Bloom and his most famous work, The Anxiety of Influence, which he wrote or published in 1973. And in this work, he says, his main argument here really is that the meaning of a poem is always going to be another poem. So he thought that imagination was really misinterpretation, that writers, any creative artist, was responding to the works that came before them, and that's their anxiety. That's the anxiety of influence. And they're responding to these in a way that they're misinterpreting them, and that's what they're this new thing that they're creating. And so that's, I think, an interesting angle for us to look at. Well, what are the inspirations for Mary Shelley? So again, I'm going to quote from my essay. Although Mary Shelley cites Shakespeare's The Tempest and A Midsummer Night's Dream as influences on Frankenstein in its preface, her irresistible anxiety was much closer to home and identified in her dedication to William Godwin and his masterpiece, Caleb Williams. It's fitting that Godwin should be her anxiety because he's also her father. Bloom's theory, while extending T.S. Eliot's concluding remarks in Tradition in the Individual Talent, owes much more to the brief and impactful essay Family Romances by Sigmund Freud. Freud begins that essay with the claim that all social progress in general rests upon opposition between the generations. What on the surface appears to be a family-centered adaptation of Marx's dialectical materialism, Freud develops into a general theory of imaginative work. The opposition between generations begins in the home between child and parent and has implications based on sex. Freud reasons a boy is far more inclined to feel hostile impulses towards his father than towards his mother, and has a far more intense desire to free himself from him than from her. The effect of this sex difference, Freud argues, leads to weaker imaginative activity in girls. For Freud grounds the imagination in the wish fulfillment and the correction of real life, which manifests first in daydreaming and later in imaginative art. So for Freud, imagination, creative power comes from this challenging of the old generation, trying to change it. You want to correct your real life. That's where the imaginative powers begin. And he argued that since boys have a stronger desire or more hostility towards their fathers, to change that element of it, that that greater hostility is going to lead to greater creativity than for women. Now, I know this obviously makes most people recoil, the idea of sex-based differences in art, and to a certain degree, I think it should. I don't think we should assume that there are sex-based differences, but we should also not ignore them if the record shows that to be the case. And I think we can see this. Of course, there have been ways throughout history for women to bypass the male dominance of literature. So, for instance, Mary Shelley published her novel anonymously. You've had other writers like the Bronte sisters who published their novels under male pseudonyms. One of those, Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights, I think really is a truly great work of literature that kind of stands out in the canon. But despite these ways of getting around, and despite the liberalization that happened in the 20th century, and really now the indisputable dominance of women in literature, not only in publishing books every year, but also in buying them, consuming them, reading them, it still hasn't changed the tradition at all. And that's something I think we need to face, not just ignore. So getting back to Mary Shelley's anxieties, her influences, she had really three. She was maybe unlucky enough to have three famous people in her life. Her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, was a famous writer on women's rights issues. However, she died after giving birth to Mary, so Mary never met her. And the only novel she wrote, or she wrote two novels, but one that was published in her lifetime, and it wasn't a significant novel, hasn't had great impact. Her husband really liked it, but it didn't influence, at least not from what we can see, it didn't influence Mary Shelley at all. Mary Shelley's husband, obviously the great poet, Percy Shelley, is quoted in Frankenstein, but I think it's more just for kind of mood and atmosphere, not really for the themes of the story. So that really leaves Caleb Williams, her father, the novel that her father wrote. And this novel is very impactful and influential on Frankenstein. It has many of the same themes, which I'm going to get to in a moment. And it even has similar voice. In the opening of this novel, in a lot of ways, the opening of this novel could sound like Victor Frankenstein looking back on his life and discussing it in retrospect, commenting on it. So I'm going to start off by reading the opening of Caleb Williams. My life has for several years been a theater of calamity. I have been a mark for the vigilance of tyranny, and I could not escape. My fairest prospects have been blasted. My enemy has shown himself inaccessible to entreaties and untired in persecution. My fame, as well as my happiness, has become his victim. Everyone, as far as my story has been known, has refused to assist me in my distress and has execrated my name. I have not deserved this treatment. So in the opening, we can see, just like in Frankenstein, we have these themes of like persecution and pursuit. In this case, it's Caleb Williams being pursued by who was his boss, Mr. Falkland. But just like Caleb Williams said, that last line that I quoted, I have not deserved this treatment. I think this makes this novel a lot more effective than Frankenstein, because Frankenstein often does deserve the treatment that he gets. He certainly is not faultless. The novels have other connections. Caleb Williams really primarily deals with the corruption of power and injustice of law and social status, social rank, whereas Frankenstein is dealing with the corruption of knowledge, really with science. So it's a similarity, but also a difference there. And these are going to become important as we talk about this a little bit more. The story of Caleb Williams, in brief, we have his boss. He's a servant. Caleb Williams is a servant, young man servant for this older rich man, this aristocrat named Falkland, and like similar to the Oedipus Frankenstein theme, of pursuing knowledge that becomes dangerous, Caleb Williams realizes that Mr. Falkland has some secret and he wants to find out what it is, and he does uncover it. It's that Falkland has killed someone in the past. And this is really what, he admits to this, and this is what leads to this kind of revenge that he tries to have and control over Caleb Williams. Just like in Frankenstein, though, we get that story second-handed. Most of volume 1 of Caleb Williams, which again, just like Frankenstein, is a 3-volume work. Most of volume 1 is a secondhand story we get from this guy named Mr. Collins. However, again, this is done better than Frankenstein because Caleb is actually the main character. And Caleb, we're invested in him as a character. We're not invested in Walton. And in a lot of ways, we're not invested in Frankenstein himself. We really, as I said, we care more about the daemon. Another interesting connection here is that Caleb Williams is really focused on society. Society is the persecutor, whereas in Frankenstein, the persecutor is something bigger. It's society. It's not society. It's being. Most of Frankenstein takes place in complete desolate areas, right? Most of the novel is really just there to prepare for these kind of 2 important meetings between Frankenstein and his demon. Now, an important connection between both of these works, and this is where we're going to get more towards the Freud argument and get back into the idea of sex differences and also the anxiety of influence within the family, is that both novels are really dealing with fathers that have rejected their sons. So Frankenstein has rejected the daemon, and Mr. Falkland has rejected Caleb. So that's at core, that's the relationships that we're seeing here. And they have different perspectives, though. We've got Mr. Falkland is rejecting the next generation because he's trying to protect his power, and he thinks that, if they discover something, he's gonna lose that power. And Frankenstein is rejecting the son, the second generation, because he thinks that second generation is corrupt in itself. So in Caleb Williams, it's the previous generation that's corrupt, trying to maintain his power. In Frankenstein, it's the next generation that's corrupt and is being rejected just for that alone. And I think we can see this. Interestingly, in the last meetings, in both novels, we have kind of the last meetings between father-son, and again, I'm using these metaphorically, they're not actual father-son. So let's compare these. So we've got the first one here I'm going to read is Mr. Falkland talking to Caleb. He says, "Your forbearance has proved, as I all along suspected, empty and treacherous. You have attempted to blast my reputation. You have sought to disclose the select and eternal secret of my soul. Because you have done that, I will never forgive you. I will remember it to my last breath. The memory shall survive me when my existence is no more. Do you think you are out of the reach of my power because a court of justice has acquitted you?" And now listen to the daemon in Frankenstein. He sounds a lot like Mr. Falkland. "Slave, I before reasoned with you, but you have proved yourself unworthy of my condescension. Remember that I have power. You believe yourself miserable, but I can make you so wretched that the light of day will be hateful to you. You are my creator, but I am your master. Obey." So here we get an interesting, we have the father-son dynamics and the father rejecting the son, but we get a different, we get a shifting of who the tyrant is. So in Caleb Williams, the father is the tyrant, and the father is trying to control the son. So again, to protect himself, and the son has to overcome that. In Frankenstein, however, we get the son becomes the tyrant. And so what I think Shelley is doing here is she is taking that same generational conflict that Freud talked about, but she's inverting it. And so as I write here, Shelley inverts, or rather changes, the key of the traditional generational opposition. Like Oedipus, the son is now punished not for what he has done, but for what he is. Being is the problem. The crime is ontological, not ethical. So in Caleb Williams, which again I think is the more interesting novel, we have sympathy for Caleb Williams because it's an ethical conflict. He did not deserve what he did, and we're rooting for him to overcome that ethical problem. Whereas in Frankenstein, that's not the case. It's just the generation is somehow flawed. We don't really know. It's a bit of a mystery. Finishing up, Godwin, despite his reputation as a radical, was ultimately a reformer and therefore believer in system improvement. Shelley, on the other hand, sees progress as destructive, for the beings that execute it are cosmic abominations. That's the second generation. While this sounds overly antisocial, it coheres with the original sin that grounds Western culture and therefore transports its readers home. This is one side of its popularity. So I acknowledge, I think this novel is popular because it's exploring an ontological problem. And again, it doesn't give us clear answers like we might get in Caleb Williams. And maybe that in part, lends it to as a kind of a precursor to modernism. But so it's interested in that way, that ontological problem, but it's not really given an answer. The other narrative, is the second narrative, the sub-narrative of Frankenstein, which is the story of Shelley as cosmic abomination, becoming aware of this status and in anger at what she is, rejecting her creator. Readers don't need to be aware of this story, but it's there and they feel it. So the second story is that anxiety of influence, this realization from Mary Shelley that she's not her father. She didn't write Caleb Williams, and she's not going to write it. But Frankenstein is basically that struggle. Finally, Frankenstein then is the story of a daughter who sees herself as less than her father, but refuses to accept it. It's also the story of a world that sees the daughter as greater than her father, but only because they failed to know their past. And I think that's last point is particularly important, that we should be reading Frankenstein, of course, and critiquing it. But we should also check out and critique and read the book that really influenced it, which is Caleb Williams, which again I'm arguing is the better book. And knowledge of this book will certainly make knowledge of this book deeper, and it will give this a better reading. Well, let me know what you think in the comments. And as I said, please go and check out the essay. Thank you.